Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning for what will be an interesting deep dive into the King's speech yesterday, plus also an analysis of the first couple of weeks of Labour in power and what that might tell us about the future, and also what we can expect over the next few months leading up to the autumn statement that we'll see. It's going to be rapid fire, 45 minutes. You're going to get a level of insight and detail which you wouldn't otherwise get, particularly from reading the papers or listening to politicians. So please feel free to ask questions as we go along, put it in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. I'm Andy Galdard, Chief Communications Officer for Willmott Dixon. I'm delighted to today welcome Greg Baker, who is Chair of the Political Intelligence Business, Baker Kell Cumming, and Greg will be dissecting the past 24 hours and will be providing a mine of information that's going to help us in terms of navigate the next 4 or 5 years of the Labour government. So welcome, Greg. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I think, first of all, though, before we kick off, Greg, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in your current role?
Yeah, sure. The short answer, Andy, is by accident. So originally, I started out in the army in military intelligence. That was some 20, 25 years ago. Since then, spent some time in Westminster, in Parliament, and a polling company, working on campaigns in the UK and the US, a few other countries as well. And then about 14 years ago, I set up BKC, Baker Kell Cumming. And we are a political intelligence firm, pure political intelligence. So we're not lobbying. We don't try and change laws on behalf of anyone. Really, what we try to do is to predict what's going to happen in politics and how it's going to affect our clients' commercial interests. Really trying to give strength to their elbow and let them see what's coming around the corner. I think one of the things in our favour is that bureaucracies around the world, including in the UK, by definition, produce a lot of paper, and we know where to find the documents that they don't want to go into public, and we know how to read the ones that are. So an awful lot of what we reveal to clients is effectively hidden in plain sight, but we provide that analysis and interpretation. So it's professional geekery, really, but it's a lot of fun.
No, thanks. And I know it's going to be really interesting over the next 45 minutes to hear some of that insight that you've got. You've been gleaning from those documents hidden in plain sight. But I suppose before we kick off about the King's speech, let's just look at what's happened over the past 2 weeks. It seems, if you read the media, that the Labour Party, as the new government, have hit the ground running. Has there been any surprises for you?
I suppose the short answer is no. So as you'll know, Andy, we provide a monthly intelligence brief on what we expect to come up. And for the past 6 or 7 months, that monthly brief has included an annex of all the things we expected Labour to do over the first year. And in the office, we've just been ticking them off as they work through them. I think one possible exception to on the sort of surprise scale is the speed with which some parts of the Labour Parliamentary Party have hinted at a willingness to rebel. So they obviously come in with this stonking majority, but there's already disquiet over things like the 2-child benefit cap, and it looks like Starmer isn't being given quite so much of a sort of free hand as you might expect with a majority of the size that he's got. So that's in the short term, and then I think a little bit further on, we can expect markets to cause a bit of a headache for Starmer, but perhaps we can come to that a little bit later on.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one sort of slight, I suppose it's a positive, but it looks like infrastructure and development is going to remain very much in future workers' rights reforms, which have obviously been much touted, have been assigned to the Business and Trade Secretary. So you've got 2 quite interesting, important areas of policy there, which are not going to the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner. Do you think that signals a little bit of a sidelining of Angela Rayner now the party are in government?
I think it does, to be honest, Andy. I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that Angela Rayner and Starmer have, regardless of the kind of smiles for the camera, they've had quite a fractious relationship from the start, really. It's worth remembering that it's only, 18 months ago that Starmer tried to sack Rayner, and that meeting went so badly for him that she actually walked out with a string of extra jobs, much less sort of being fired from the one that she had already. I think that the thing to bear in mind is that Angela Rayner has her own power base within the Labour Party. She's got a direct mandate from the members, given the way that they appoint their senior elected officials into various jobs. So, so going forward, I think, you think back to the kind of Blair years, and he had Prescott as a sort of translator to the left. I think Rayner is much more likely to prove to be a thorn in Starmer's side rather than someone who can necessarily help Starmer bring people who are sceptical about his agenda with him.
Yeah, and just looking at as they try and usher in this new era of change, as they keep talking about, how important is the civil service to support that, and also how influential are they to change or block that?
I mean, they are absolutely essential. They are the key to it. I think this government, to an unprecedented degree, is led by the civil service. That's literally, or was led by the civil service currently in post or former civil servants. It's literally in the case of the Prime Minister, he is a former civil servant. And beyond that, it's really notable how many civil servants Labour managed to recruit to their cause over the past year whilst they were in opposition. And that recruitment has continued, that pattern's continued into government. So you see more civil servants taking explicitly partisan roles. You take former civil servants moving into ministerial roles. Patrick Vallance is a good example of that. But more subtly and more sort of deeply, I suppose, the civil service has been advising Labour on policy for a number of months. And I would actually question the degree to which that's been constitutional. I think the extent of civil service support to the Labour Party in opposition was probably just the wrong side of the line. But that's happened, and we just have to deal with that. And now they're in government, they're pursuing that. Both ministers and the civil service are pursuing that agenda that they've kind of agreed between them. And I think to a very large degree, the civil servants they're willing to limit the available options put to ministers so that they can control the number of choices that they have. So the civil service is absolutely the keystone for this government. And I think that on the one hand, it means that the whole of the government machine at the moment is pulling in the same direction as ministers. So they have an opportunity to get some things done during this whole honeymoon period. Okay. I think the one thing I would highlight as a potential risk to Labour in that is that by definition, civil servants aren't politicians, and they might not have quite the political acumen that you would expect of an elected politician. So they might have a bit of a dead ear to what the public really want and how it should be presented.
Thanks. Before I'll come on to a bit more in the towards the end of this, talking about things like the autumn statement and spending review and where the storm clouds might be gathering for Labour, which you look out for. But and I'll shortly go on to the King's speech. But one interesting point which you mentioned before, which I thought is worth teasing out now. In this current state of euphoria where Labour are the new government and things are looking very rosy and optimistic, and even the relationship between Sunak and Starmer is very cordial, and they call it a bromance or something like that. But you think, interesting enough, that over the next 3-4 years, political and economic pressures will conspire, and we may not see a full term. The Labour Party may indeed need to go back for another election within 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always slightly wary of coming across as this kind of massive pessimist, and I'm not at all. I'm actually tremendously optimistic about sort of political situation in general and how things will evolve over the next 5-10 years. But I think that there are two kind of clouds on the horizon for Labour, one in the immediate term and one more medium term. So the immediate thing, and it's just a chance of the calendar, but if I was a Labour Party advisor, I'd actually be quite, I'd have a slight tinge of regret that they've entered into government just before the summer recess, because Parliament's about to disappear for the best part of 2 months, and a large part of Labour's political honeymoon is going to be spent when Parliament isn't around to do very much. And over that summer spell, the touch button issues that really kind of fire public opinion, and not necessarily in a good way, they're not going to get any better over the next couple of months. So, for example, on immigration, the summer's likely to see an ever increasing number of people arriving in small boats. On the NHS, with a review being commissioned by Wes Street, I think is a necessary first step, but a review isn't actually addressing some of the problems. And similarly with crime and a sort of host of other social issues. Effectively, all the time Parliament isn't in place, the government finds it much harder to be seen to addressing these problems. So that's the short-term cloud. The bigger one is on the medium term. And I think one of the things that just hasn't really been very widely appreciated is that Labour's whole macroeconomic agenda, in our view, is predicated on one quite brave bet. So effectively, Reeves hopes to be able to redefine some of the public sector's debt and its liabilities as assets, so that it can subsequently go to the markets, borrow more money, but without suffering a sort of penalty level rate of interest as a result. And I'm just dubious as to whether or not the markets are going to buy that. If I went to my bank manager and said, actually, I'm going to count my mortgage as an asset to me, and with that in mind, I should be allowed to borrow more, I'm not sure if they go for it. And I think that the government faces a risk of having the same kind of door slams in their face. And if they do, they will have some fairly unpalatable choices to make. They will either need to borrow considerably more money at considerably higher rates of interest. They will either need to raise taxes very dramatically, or they will have to cut spending. And none of those things come very easily to a Labour government. So I think there's a very good prospect, a very high prospect of Labour being unable to see out the full 5-year term, and instead having to go back to the electorate for another mandate. I think it's actually worth bearing in mind that when people think about Labour governments, because the recent past, the most prominent example was the kind of Blair Brown era and 3 successive general election wins and so on, and an element of stability. I think that shrouds from memory the sort of previous Labour record in office, and that tended to lead to fairly short-lived administrations. And I think it's much more likely to kind of revert to the mean rather than to replicate what Blair achieved, which was notable because it was rarity.
And I had a question there, actually. Someone in terms of the information, where have you got the information around the attempt to redefine debt as assets?
So a lot of it's been sort of hinted at or even mentioned explicitly in speeches that the now Labour frontbenchers have made over the past 18 months. I mean, we really swim in this stuff all the time, and we sort of monitor the comments that are made as asides or to very small audiences, or that are even couched in phrases that require a certain amount of interpretation. I mean, one of the examples I always give to clients in explaining what we do, there's this arcane part of parliamentary procedure called written parliamentary questions, and the government answers thousands of them, literally thousands of them every week, and most of them are frankly inane. You'll have a backbench MP saying, would the minister agree with me that my local football team should be congratulated on its promotion? And 99% of them the minister simply replies and says, yes, I do congratulate you and well done. But occasionally, at one time in 1,000, the minister will reply with, yes, we congratulate your local football team, and I'm glad that they're succeeding with their new strike forward, who is enjoying our new immigration system and the qualifications for workers. And that will count for the government as announcing a whole new policy to Parliament. And we just have an ability to be able to spot those tiny announcements and those hints. And I think that, if I could be bold enough to say it, the proof's in the pudding. Our reports tend to be kind of 6 months ahead of what's in the public domain at least, and so we're quite confident on some of those predictions.
Excellent. Well, you heard it here first then. So thanks. And I've got a few more questions, but I'll come to those a bit later on. One relates to levelling up and the money that's been promised, but I'll come on to that because I want to just talk a little bit about the King's speech, which obviously is still fresh and less than 24 hours old. But was there any surprises for you?
I think really only in terms of speed. So, on the one hand, some of the things that we'd anticipated in our monthly reports include things like seeking regulatory realignment with the European Union. And I think that in one sense, they've been quite wise to try to use their political capital to do something quite controversial. So one of the things I think has been underappreciated in the King's speech is the extent to which the government will seek to explicitly and immediately realign with EU regulations on products, for example. And more than that, the King's speech has also hinted at the introduction of a law that would allow the government to automatically update any other regulation on the UK statute book with EU law as that evolves. So, if you can bear the shudder of the sort of reminder of the Brexit debates, they've effectively readopted dynamic realignment with the EU, and so doing that really quickly was brave, but I can see why they did it.
Yeah, and sorry, Greg, and also in that vein, have they held off from signing up to the World Treaty Organization? Is that the World Trade Organization?
So one of there's one international free trade agreement that the previous administration had negotiated but hadn't ratified. So that's the CPTPP, and that is not actually due to be ratified until the very end of the year this year. And I think that's really worth watching, because should the UK ratify that, it would become markedly harder for His Majesty's government to align with EU regulations in kind of every sphere. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that ends up being delayed indefinitely. So the CPTPP is essentially a trade bloc around the Pacific Rim. And the Conservative-led administration had made a sort of great store in signing up to it. They have signed up to it; it's all agreed, but it's not actually ratified yet. It's not due to be ratified until October, November. So I think that'll be really worth keeping an eye on. It's one of those things that could get kicked into the long grass almost indefinitely.
I know that one of the themes yesterday was about taking the brakes off the UK economy, and which sounds great. Who'd want to apply brakes to growth? But if it was that easy, surely the Tories would have done it previously. I mean, what are Labour going to try and do, looking at its legislative agenda? What are Labour going to try and do to achieve what the Tories hadn't been able to achieve?
Well, I think with housing, it's very, very, very difficult for the Labour government to kind of click their fingers and bring about a massive snap change. I think the things that they will try to do, firstly, is to dramatically expand the use of compulsory purchase orders, and not only expand their use, but also change the terms in which they're applied. So I think compulsory purchase orders are very likely to be pursued with compensation rather than market rates being offered to landowners. I think that's going to be very controversial. I think they're going to face an awful lot of legal challenge. but it's one of the things they'll try to do in terms of the market. The other, and I think again this is worth watching, is I would expect the Labour administration to either incentivize or even mandate developers to build more housing that's available for social rent. So it's not necessarily social housing, but that would have sort of privately owned officially, but that would have a condition put on it that a local authority has to be able to use it for a set amount of time, for example.
Well, and that's obviously they've introduced targets as well for local authorities at a time obviously when you read the local authorities are in dire financial straits at the moment. How's that going to play out with local authorities? Either half of them saying that they may have to issue Section 114s over the next couple of years.
So this is an issue that we've been talking about for about 4 or 5 years. There's a very large number of local authorities who have, I was going to say really abused the Public Works Loans Board system, whereby officials could effectively call up the Treasury, and they had to call. You weren't allowed to do it with anything that created a written record, which I think should put up some flags to start off with. But they could call the Treasury and borrow almost any amount of money for any project, and simply on the promise of being able to pay it back one day. That money has largely been used for speculative commercial investments, and unsurprisingly, a lot of it's fallen flat. So I think the parlor state of local government financing is underappreciated, and it's likely to sort of come more to the fore, and it's going to be a pretty nasty surprise to ministers. I think there are also a couple of comments worth making about the new government's approach to local authorities in general. There's been lots and lots of talk about more devolution, their take back control bill as they called it. And I think I just strike a couple of notes of caution about that. The first is that historically it's very easy for opposition parties to promise to hand power from central government to almost anyone else who's closest to the citizen. What tends to happen is as soon as ministers are actually in office and they have that power, they become much more jealous of it and much less inclined to give it away. It's just human nature. The other thing I would say is that we've already seen with this new Labour government that on the one hand, they're promising to create or support the creation of new devolved bodies for regional government, for example. So on the one hand, you can argue that they are kind of trying to create the institutions that would allow for devolution. But at the same time, they are being much more prescriptive about what those local and regional authorities should do with that power. So whether that's house building targets or any other number of things. So really, I'd argue that the government so far looks like rather than pursuing devolution, there's much more chance of duplication and sort of delegation from the centre rather than autonomy.
Yeah, rather than real power. It's just a power in name only sort of thing, but the strings and the control is still there, and the allocation of funding is still very much held by the Treasury, which is obviously a big bugbear for the last government. I've just had another question actually from Peter Littlejohn's. The housing sector writ large has expressed doubt that Labour's 1.5 million homes ambition will become a reality without an injection of capital. Do you think they're likely to provide this through boosted GLA and Homes England funding, or rely on private investment to fill the gaps?
I think they're going to be very heavily reliant on private investment for large-scale infrastructure and large-scale development projects. I think that's going to lead to much more, again, advice that eventually turns into a mandatory orders on things like pension funding, so pension funds assets and where they're allocated. But on the 1.5 million target, I don't want to sound like a pessimist or a naysayer, but I just try and look at things objectively. So that 1.5 million target is predicated on 300,000 new houses every year. I think even if they introduce reform quite quickly, it's unlikely that 300,000 target is going to be addressed in the first year, which means automatically there's a backlog. So you're hoping for much higher rates towards the end of the parliament, even assuming they do the full parliament. And then I would also look a bit further, sort of through the process. It's not just a matter of funding. The new government would have to be willing to substantially change some of the regulations required for large-scale development, and that doesn't necessarily match up with their other agenda of realigning with EU regulations, whether that's nutrient qualities or anything else. So, and that's even before you start looking at things like supporting infrastructure, roads, energy, all those sorts of things. I think they've got a lot of hurdles to jump over, and I think if it really was just a matter of pressing a button, and there were 300,000 new houses being developed every year, the last government would have done it. So I think they're going to come up against some problems they hadn't necessarily anticipated. Now they're actually sort of going home with the red boxes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, clearly 1.5 sounds a great figure when you're in opposition and when you're campaigning, but to actually deliver that, as you say, I mean, the Tories had a figure of 200,000 a year, and now when they realised that wasn't achievable, they quietly dropped it, didn't they? So
that's right. And the Labour government's also got some. I mean, I think this is it's a secondary factor, but the Labour government also now finds itself in a position in terms of politics that it wasn't in before. So 8 weeks ago, the Labour government was the Labour opposition, its parliamentary party, was very, very heavily represented by urban seats. Now they've got this stonking majority, but it does also mean they've got a huge number of constituencies in rural areas, and so some of their backbenchers, I think, might be adopting a slightly different tune on large-scale investment.
We've already seen it, haven't we? Even within the past 2 weeks, one Labour MP came out saying, well, not in my backyard sort of thing. So there's interesting dynamic at play now that new Labour MPs, to retain their seats, are going to have to come out fighting against development. And that's clearly going to be part of the mix, isn't it, in terms of how the Labour Party navigates that?
Yeah, I mean, you've even seen one of the new Green MPs opposing the sort of green version of electricity pylons. Because it kind of goes across her patch. So those local incentives really do weigh heavily with MPs.
Just another question here from Anthony. Obviously, levelling up was a big issue for us in terms of allocation of money to local authorities and projects that came as a result of which were fantastic. And clearly, there's been a step back from levelling up. I guess levelling up by Labour has been seen as very much a Tory policy. Therefore, they quickly dropped the name from their title of the new housing ministry. Do you think that levelling up will continue to provide funding for capital schemes?
I think the thing I would look for is the extent to which the government tries to persuade or demand that commercial organisations fund social policy. So the government is very, very short of cash, and some of the ambitions that the previous administration had for levelling up are now, if they're going to be pursued at all, are effectively going to have to be funded by the private sector. So I would expect to see the Labour administration making more and more costly demands of especially large employers in terms of things like sort of training a local population or investing in local infrastructure, even in areas where they don't actually have an immediate footprint. So I think the government's going to try to pass on the cost of levelling up, if you like, rather than necessarily just abandon it completely.
One other question that's come in, which is interesting, but do you see Labour Party, going back to your point about not having a lot of cash, reintroducing PFI, albeit under a different name?
Well, I think that's starting to get close to what they're going to do with pension funds. I mean, the brand PFI is pretty poisonous politically, so I don't see them going for that. But they will steadily increase the reliance on private sector funding, and obviously to be able to persuade large volumes of private assets to go into public infrastructure, they need to be offered some kind of return. And so I think that they will look at an alternative scheme, but they wouldn't go back to the same branding.
Do you think, I mean, this is a very much a partisan question, because obviously working in the construction industry, we're all about building in different sectors, and some of our key sectors include things like education, schools, colleges, universities, defence, healthcare, that sort of thing. Will we see any disruption in the capital programs that we've seen previously, or is the new Labour government likely to draw down on its spending, or will we see a boon of spending, focus on those areas that perhaps we haven't seen previously?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good point, and it's something that I would encourage you to kind of bear in mind as a background issue. So to take a really broad view, just for a moment, then go into a bit more detail. The broad view, given the rise in geopolitical risk, most Western governments, including the UK, are going to have to take a serious view on rebalancing their spending. So, in short, that means more soldiers, less doctors, less welfare. The thing to watch over the coming months is going to be the order in which the budget happens in the autumn, and the government publishes its review audit of problems in the NHS and its strategic defence review. Now, the reason the order matters is, so you've got the big fiscal event, the statement with the budget, setting out the government's sort of tax and spending plans. With the NHS review, that is going to come up with a list of maladies that need a lot of money to address. With the security and defence review, that's going to come up with a long list of things. But I mean, we currently have, despite being a sort of P5 nuclear power, we have an inability to put brand new aircraft carriers to sea, even with 18 months' notice. So there are big problems in defence. If those two things, the NHS review and the defence review, are published before the budget, it means that the Chancellor will then be under pressure to address those two areas of spending before they do anything else. If those two things are published after the budget will be able to, I mean, it will almost carry on with a status quo and then have to, it's more sticking plaster spending afterwards. So, at the moment, there's within Whitehall, there's a conflict in ideas between paying for things as circumstances allow and paying for things as circumstances demand. And if those two big reviews come before the budget, it's more likely to be a case of circumstances demanding a change in government spending. Now, all of that is a prelude to saying that if the government is forced into dramatically reassessing and rebalancing its spending priorities, that's going to have a knock-on effect to every other sector that isn't one of those two priority areas of defence and health.
Yeah, so key is how they frame it.
That's right.
And yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like looking beyond the headline, isn't it? So thanks to what you told us, we'll look at the order and we can see exactly what happens, and we'll know exactly what's coming as a result of that. If they come before the ordinance statement or budget, then we know where the priority is going to lay. But if they wait until afterwards, then you say they can crack on, perhaps with where they were, sort of thing. Just one last thing about geopolitics, because I know we mentioned and we looked at things like Ukraine and the impact that's had, but we often not quite sure what's going to quite happen over in Taiwan. And I know previously you've spoken a bit about it, and what could happen between China and Taiwan and how that might have an impact on the worldwide economy. Do you think things are going to calm down a bit, or do you think there's still more to happen over there, which we need to be mindful about?
Yeah, so we cover a number of different markets around the world, including China, the US, India, the EU, and for a while now we've been attaching an 80% probability to China taking military action around Taiwan within the next 18 months. Now, I would stress that that is much more likely to take the form of a blockade of the island rather than an invasion. And there's a number of reasons for that, not least because it's sort of perversely, it's slightly easier to justify under international law, which you can go into if you want to. But so we see China, there's a very high prospect of China adopting a blockade or instilling a blockade around Taiwan. Now that's going to obviously have massive implications for world trade. And the way that plays out will be determined within the first 5 days of the blockade being installed. And 5 days is important because that's effectively how long it takes the US to send sufficient military assets to the region if they want to dissuade China from continuing its blockade. So within 5 days, you'll effectively see how the rest of the world would react to that blockade. And then subsequently, you'll be able to see how China decides to either dissemble or manage that blockade, and the extent to which they allow trade to cross it. And is it simply a matter of them attaching massive tariffs to anything going to and from Taiwan, or does everything have to go via the Chinese mainland? If you think back to earlier on this year and the late part of last year, and some of the disruption in the Red Sea, I would take that as a good indicator of how that disruption might play out and how different countries might react to it. And so, I'm afraid we do attach quite a high probability to a blockade around Taiwan within the foreseeable future.
It's interesting. Obviously, the last 24 hours, Trump has also come out with what appears to be quite a softening approach towards Taiwan rather than a belligerent, well, if something happens to Taiwan, we'll defend it at all costs sort of thing. So maybe that's something which the Republicans, and Trump particularly, if they're looking towards becoming president next year, they're aware that this might happen or something might happen, and they have to even now get their story in as to how they might approach and tackle it, and the level of protection they'll like to afford Taiwan going forward.
I mean, I think there's something to that. I mean, I would also though stress that every American president, and Trump especially, when it comes to Taiwan, an awful lot of it is about sort of presentation and deterrence, rather than necessarily laying all their cards on the table. So, in short, I wouldn't necessarily take what he might say now about Taiwan as a cut and dried sort of prediction for how the administration will actually react.
Just looking at also at the energy independence bill, one of the first few things which Labour have done is suspend licenses for North Sea drilling. So clearly they're on a mission here. How do you think that's going to play out in the UK?
I think their ambitions don't quite match up with what's really practical. I think the new Labour administration's biggest impact in the sector is likely to be around the extent to which some energy infrastructure is nationalised, so it'll be brought into public control. But in terms of actually achieving what they want to by 2030, which is extraordinarily ambitious, and you've even had National Grid coming out publicly, explicitly, saying that they see it as impossible, and for a number of reasons. Some of the projects that Miliband is hoping to pursue are unlikely to come online on time. If they did, there probably wouldn't be sufficient grid around the country to connect them. And even if there was grid, you'd still need a backup system equivalent to 100% of UK generation that was reliant on fossil fuels. So I think that the short of all of that is, yes, on the one hand, the Labour administration has got these massive ambitions in energy and as far as their sort of net zero agenda goes. But our sort of baseline assumption is that net zero is only really going to be achieved if there is a an enormous step forward in technological capability. So that could be fusion, for example. And up until then, the UK is going to continue to be ultimately reliant on fossil fuels and interconnectors with continental Europe. So sort of importing energy supplies from our nearest neighbours.
Thanks. I know Nick asked a question. Hopefully that answered that question about how the new government's green agenda differs from the previous government. It seems that there's a lot to come on that. Another question from Peter about housing associations. With housing associations so strapped for cash, are being delayed and cancelled across the country in lieu of government funding, do you think there'll be an increase in joint ventures in the industry to deliver against local authority targets?
I think that's, I don't want to give a mealy-mouthed answer, but I think that's a good example of an issue where people like you, Andy, really earn your supper, because it's one of those issues where there's going to be room for the government to be persuaded to take a particular line. So it's the sort of area where if I was a lobbyist, I would be trying to sort of concentrate my fire, because I think that there's room for movement either way, and the administration isn't set on a final decision yet. So yeah, Andy, I would add that to your to-do list.
Okay, no, I've got a decent one, so I'll do thanks. And just in terms of the autumn statement, and I guess that's the real meat of it. So we've had the King's speech. That's an interesting insight into what's going to be planned over the next couple of years from a legislative point of view, and there's still more to be coming after that. There's different cycles of legislative agendas, so there'll be another cycle after a couple of years. But obviously, what's it worth? I know you've already alluded it. What's it worth looking out for when the autumn statement does come?
So I think, there'll be some small or relatively small things that they do sort of quite quickly. VAT on schools is going to feature there, and I would imagine that that's going to be designed to come into place in September of next year. The big one is whether they try to set out their ambitions for new borrowing criteria, as I described before. The other thing I would sort of encourage you to keep an eye on is the next spending review, and in fact, it's going to be the next spending reviews. So the government's conceded to the civil service that it's going to conduct a 1-year spending review first. So it's basically setting the spending envelope for every department for 1 year. I'd suggest that's a concession to the civil service, because it gives officials effectively 1 more year of status quo spending and a further year to delay or obstruct ministers from introducing more dramatic change in a 5-year spending review. So this autumn we should see a 1-year spending review process kicked off with a view to sort of funding departments from April. But it's the 5-year spending review that follows and that will be conducted over the course of the next 6 to 12 months that's really going to have a bigger impact for the long term. So yeah. I sort of encourage you to look out for those two different things.
That's obviously going to be dictated by geopolitical situation, the defence, and other factors we just mentioned. So that's going to be just I appreciate we're running out of time, but just in terms of, it looks like at the moment that we're looking at another Trump presidency. I mean, that's not guaranteed, but at the moment it looks like that could be the case. How is that going to play out for the Labour Party?
Well, I think every other Western country other than the US is going to have to spend more on defence. We've already seen that starting to play out across the EU and to some extent in the UK as well. When Sunak was Prime Minister, he promised a quite substantial uplift in defence spending. So there'll be that. In terms of sort of looking a bit further ahead, there are some potential opportunities for the UK. So, for example, I would say the prospect of a free trade agreement with America is much higher, or would be much higher, under a second Trump administration than it would be under a second Biden administration. So there are those sort of substantive things, and then there's the more sort of superficial stuff. So I'd suggest that Labour frontbenchers are probably going to have to mind more of their P's and Q's around a Trump president if he comes in. I mean, it's not it's not traditional diplomatic form to call the US president a Nazi sympathizer. So that sort of thing, I think, would have to be wrote in a bit.
Yeah. Just two last questions. One from Anthony quickly. What do you feel the Labour approach will be in regards to rectifying cladding issues? Because that's become a big issue for the wider construction industry and also the development industry, because a lot of money now is going towards recladding, and that's obviously channeling money away from new housing. So at a time when the Labour government want new housing, a lot of that money is now going to recladding. So it'd be interesting to see how that is dealt with and what Labour might do to sort of try and alleviate perhaps some of the onerous spending that's required, not just by developers, but also by contractors as well.
Yeah. No, I think with cladding, the two things I'd say, and I appreciate the time points, I'll try and keep it brief. One is that the last administration's approach was very sort of closely designed by the civil service, and so the new administration is going to build on that. And the second is that on the sort of finer points, we do actually have a bit more information on that. So if anyone wants to speak to me separately, then perhaps we can have a chat about that and try and share a bit more detailed information.
Just one last question, and obviously, if there is another election in the next 4 years, it seems obvious that the Conservatives and Reform are going to have to sort things out, maybe find an accommodation, or the Conservatives are going to have to come up with some solution to Reform, because obviously a lot of the seats, the vote was split. Are Reform a flash in a pan? Sorry, a flash in a pan, or clearly Starmer mentioned them yesterday in terms of snake oil salesmen, that sort of thing, or are they here to stay?
I think Reform's prospects depend on their ability. Well, they depend on two things. The first is their ability to build a nationwide infrastructure. So they have this. So any other party would envy their national media profile, but they don't have on the ground grassroots infrastructure in every constituency around the country. They would need to address that to significantly build on what they want to do. And I would say that we're likely to see between 6 and 12 by-elections every year of this parliament. And I would watch for how well Reform performs in those, because that will be a good indicator of their on-the-ground strength. The second thing I would point out is their biggest asset at the moment is Farage. And like him or loathe him, he has an unmatched ability to kind of control the ring in the circus of media politics. He can get profile whenever he wants, and I've no doubt that he will do over the course of this parliament. But that is also their biggest weakness. It's worth bearing in mind how Reform was performing before Farage rejoined the fray. It is all on his shoulders at the moment. And I'm not saying this would happen, but if in a year's time he was offered some spectacular job by the Trump presidency, then there's no guarantee that he continues to kind of plug away in the UK. I would imagine he will, but if he were to leave, that would be an instant existential threat to Reform.
No, thanks. And I think unfortunately we're pretty much there, really. I mean, it's been really insightful, and we could carry on. And if any of you would like to speak to Greg, he's on LinkedIn. Please also link into me as well. Thanks everyone outside Willmott Dixon that joined us, and obviously, if you want to speak to us about anything to do with construction and capital projects, then just give us a shout. But from our perspective, we'll look to continue to hold these webinars for key big political events to help us navigate them, provide much needed insights. So thanks everyone for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you, Greg, for your time too, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.